So it's hard to believe, but it's been over 20 years that I've been working on building and driving Toyota Corollas. I've owned a first generation, actually multiple first generation KE10 Corollas. I've owned, I don't know, countless AE86 Corollas. But the one Corolla that I've always wanted to build for myself and have never really gotten the chance to complete from start to finish is the TE27 1970-ish to 1974 Toyota Corolla. Now, it's not because I haven't actually owned one long enough to put one together and drive it. It's just that throughout the circumstances of life and business and AE86s, every time I've owned one, I haven't actually put the effort into putting it together from start to completion. The first TE27 that I purchased for myself was actually in 2008, the year that Levin was born. I bought a 1971 base model Corolla that I was going to build into a race car. That car sat around for approximately, I don't know, almost a decade, and nothing really happened of it. At the end of that car's life, I actually ended up cutting it up and keeping all of its pieces for this project. This is a 1973 Toyota Corolla that I bought about 5 or 6 years ago, I guess now. It was actually a complete running car, complete interior, outside was completely done. It actually almost made the drive completely home from where I purchased it from. Now, of course, as you can see, this is not a complete TE27 anymore. Now that we've moved the business and the business actually has a dedicated shop workspace now I can finally put the time into this car that it deserves. There's been a couple of times while I've owned this car that I've put a significant amount of work into it to try to get the progress rolling, but usually I'll be able to put about a week of time into it and then it sort of just gets pushed back into the corner again. A lot of that was due to the fact that there was a lot of other work going on, but a large portion of that was also because I didn't really have a dedicated space to work on it. Alternatively, when I switched the business from automotive fabrication to CNC machining, I sold off a lot of the auto fab equipment. A lot of that was due to the space constraints of the shop that we had at the time. So now I'm able to, with this new workshop, purchase some new equipment and continue the fabrication that's required to get this car finished. So this first episode is going to be very simple. I'm actually not really going to do much work on the car in this episode. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you all of the things that have gotten the car to this point. This car has almost been completely changed over chassis-wise to an AE86. There's a lot of reasons to do that, but the biggest reasons are the steering system, steering geometry of the TE27. It uses a steering box. And then also the front suspension design is not really adequate for the type of performance driving that I wanted to do with this car. So the whole front end is converted to AE86, the subframe, the suspension arms, the steering column with the tiltability out of an AE86 is installed. In the back of the car, I'm converting it to a 4-link and it has a Supra rear axle. But let me just go around the car and show you some of the stuff that's been done already. So here's just a quick walk around just to show the current state of the car. After all of the fabrication that has been done was done to the car, unfortunately the car had to sit outside on my trailer. It was covered, but it did sit outside for about 2 years, and there's a significant amount of rust on all the fabrication work. On the back end of the car, you can see there's quite a bit of the car actually missing. There was a lot of fabrication work done back here because the car was in a major accident and the repair that was done previously was very bad. So what I ended up doing was cutting off all of the bad repair work, mainly on the C-pillar here, and grafting in a new straight rear C-pillar. The rear window actually didn't fit correctly. That's all been addressed and the rear window fits correctly now. So what's going to happen back here is going to be just a lot of different fabrication stuff going on. It's going to be sort of a tube frame in the back end of it. It's going to have all original panels that are going to be grafted back on again, but they're going to be removable in case the car sees any body damage at the track. But basically where this was left off is the new C-pillar was grafted in, the rear window fits correctly, and now there's just a ton of different sheet metal work that needs to be done to reassemble the back corner of this car. This is also going to end up getting tubbed out because the wheel well size on a TE27 doesn't fit the wheel size that I want to be running on this car very well. So all of that's going to be cut out, trimmed up, welded back together. Inside the car, you'll see that the whole transmission tunnel has been replaced, and also down the center of the car is replaced. I haven't gotten to the back half of the transmission tunnel yet where the differential housing is. That's going to be another project. But the reason we had to redo the whole transmission tunnel was to fit the S2000 engine and transmission without really dropping the subframe dramatically to get it to clear the factory transmission tunnel. Also inside the car, you'll see that new wheel tubs, inner fender wells have been made, and this is to make sure that the car can have the correct steering angle for drifting, because the TE27 has very little wheel well area. I'll show more of this once I lift the car up, but the A pillar is connected to the B pillar through the rocker panel, and then there's this strut tower brace that's been attached. The strut tower brace itself is going to be welded to the strut tower. That hasn't been done yet. The front tubs have been cut out and reshaped to clear for better wheel clearance as well. Here's a look at the S2000 engine sitting in the car. The engine sits with our JSB billet mounts on an A86 crossmember, so mounting the engine was actually pretty simple. It was much more difficult to mount the crossmember itself. As a part of mounting the A86 crossmember and steering rack, I also wanted to install the A86 steering column. So this is an A86 column with tilt attachment mounted to the TE27 body. So this is a billet bracket that was made to adapt to the original location where the steering box column attached to. And then not only does it have the A86 column, but the whole pedal assembly was swapped over as well. This is so that I can use the much better vacuum booster and hydraulic setup of an A86. The brakes on the TE27 are definitely not going to work for track use. Here's a look at the A86 brake booster, master, and clutch master setup installed. So what I did was I actually cut out a steel plate that mounted the pedal assembly and the master cylinders, and then welded that into the firewall. For the gas pedal and for the wiring harness disconnect, I machined a plate that also bolts to the firewall, so this holds the throttle cable and the wiring harness. Now, before I go into more of the details as far as what the engine setup's going to be in this car, let's lift the car up and just take a look underneath at the chassis work that's been done underneath there. So underneath the car, you can now see the A86 crossmember. Now, obviously, switching to the A86 crossmember has a lot of benefits. The benefits include being able to switch to a steering rack. Suspension components are much more readily available. I'm much more familiar with the geometries and setting up the car to drive correctly. So it was pretty much a no-brainer to put the A86 stuff in here. But putting an A86 crossmember into a TE27 really isn't that simple. The mounting of the crossmember into the frame rails does not line up at all. So the frame rails themselves had to be modified so that I could bolt the crossmember to the frame rails. The hardware that attaches the crossmember onto the frame rails on a TE27 is 10mm hardware, and on the A86 it's 12mm hardware. So the frame rails themselves actually had to be cut open, and the sleeves inside that hold the crossmember to the frame rail had to be removed. New sleeves had to be installed to accept the 12mm hardware, and then welded back together. And then on top of that, the crossmember itself had to be modified because the narrower frame rail width so that it could bolt together. Underneath the crossmember had to be notched to clear the S2000 sump. And then the front radiator support had to be modified to accept the A86 tension rod mounts. All of this was attached with machined adapter brackets, so these actually bolt on to the original location. This is just an adapter. The fabricated lower radiator support has nutserts inside of it to hold the new hardware here. The A86 crossmember obviously is attached with a short subframe spacer just for hood clearance. And then all of the suspension components are just A86. All of this stuff is just temporary. Obviously, this is just to get the car rolling around. All of this stuff will end up being replaced with much higher quality parts near the end. Moving underneath the car, you can see the exhaust from the turbo setup coming down along the frame. That moves us to the crossmember. So this is obviously the S2000 transmission mounted across between the frame rails, and then some clearancing for the new exhaust setup to go underneath. Because the TE27 is such a lightweight chassis, it's really not designed for heavy use, especially track use. The body's not very strong. So I wanted to reinforce the body as much as I could to prepare for all of the abuse that I was going to be putting it through. So what I ended up doing, let me show you. So normally on the TE27, this is the lower frame rail here. It actually only goes to right here, just to about where the transmission cross member is. But I wanted to tie the front of the car to the back of the car. So what I did was I took some sectioned square tubing and I welded it into the frame, and it connects all the way back to this brace right here, which connects to the B pillar. This attachment point here also is going to be connecting to the lower mount for the lower control arm on the rear axle. And that frame rail is also tied across back to the other side just to kind of stiffen things up. Now this car is also going to be getting a roll cage, so the roll cage is going to tie into all of this tubing work that's already been done, so that it just sort of like ties the rear suspension and the front suspension together, unlike it was before where there was pretty much just some sheet metal. Out in the back, you can see the first generation Supra axle just sort of barely sitting in there. I whipped up some lower links just so that I could get the rear axle in place and get the car rolling again. There's no upper links attached at all. That's going to be fabricated later. And the front nose of the pumpkin is just resting in there with a tie strap. So there's still a ton of work to do to get the rear end set up. But where the axle housing sits now is about where it's going to go, and that's going to allow me to work on all of the sheet metal stuff here to get the wheel fitment correct even before I finish the 4-link setup. Here you can see that frame rail work again that was done, braced, and then tied into the rocker panel. So this rocker panel, it goes into the front, ties into the A pillar, which then ties into the strut tower. So once the roll cage is installed here, this will be a pretty rigid setup for bracing the front end of the car. Here's a look at the rusty driver's side. You can see the inner wheel well work that was done to make sure that the wheels can turn without hitting the inner fender well. It was a big issue when I was starting the fabrication on this. 15-inch wheels, especially at the low ride height, were hitting everywhere. So that's why the front tubs had to be cut out and reshaped, and the back tubs as well. Lastly, let's go over some of the details about what really makes this engine choice special to this car and also special to me. This F20C engine is actually out of my A86 drag car that I had about a decade ago. This engine is pretty much as built as you can get for a drag racing F20C engine. It's an aluminum rod engine. It's obviously sleeved, CNC ported. Everything is built to be able to withstand about 1,200 horsepower and rev to about 12,000 RPM. Now obviously it's in pretty rough shape now, and it's going to have to be disassembled, cleaned up, and sort of resealed and put back together before we can use it. But my goal with this car was to maintain the reliability of a 1,200 horsepower engine at a much lower horsepower. Our goal for this car is probably somewhere around 350 to 400 wheel horsepower. But to be able to still spin this amazing engine to 11 or 12,000 RPM while doing it. And that's going to make this an incredibly exciting car to drive. Not only is the engine sound going to be awesome, it's going to rev super high, it's going to be turbocharged with the large exhaust housing GT28 turbo, but the car is probably also going to weigh less than 2,000 pounds. That's going to put the capability of this vehicle onto an almost pro level of drifting while still maintaining just a low horsepower, somewhat small tire size, and a very nimble drivability that I really love about Toyota Corollas. So in the end, I think this will be my ultimate / favorite Corolla that I've ever built. So the next couple of episodes are most likely just going to be sort of removing the engine, addressing all of the rust from the car sitting outside, and beginning all of the sheet metal fabrication to finish the inside of the car. That's the next step here. Once that sheet metal fabrication is done, then we can start some of the tube work on the back end of the car, finish the wheel tubs on the back, get the wheel fitment situated, start doing the rear radiator mount, the fuel cell, all of the fabrication that's going to be required to finish this up. So stay tuned. I'll be trying to do updates on this about once a week. Hopefully that'll be something that I can stick to. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'll see you guys next time on our TE27 project.